Basilisk of the Grange by Emeric Hulme-Beaman. Published in Phil May's Illustrated Winter Annual, season 1900 to 1901. Read by Bethina. "This," said Luke Marriott, "is a bit of luck that I did not anticipate." And he leaned back in his chair and stared at the letter in his hand with a half-unconscious smile of satisfaction as he puffed meditatively at a large cigar. The letter was from his cousin's lawyer, and it was written to inform him that his cousin, his second cousin to be accurate, was dead, and that his estate, failing direct heirs, had now reverted to Luke Marriott as being the next of kin. "No more of this infernal drudgery now," he ejaculated. "I'll chuck doctoring and settle down to a country gentleman's life. Plenty of hunting, plenty of shooting. By the way, I suppose there are preserves there, and a town house during the season for little Ethel. By gad, we can get married at once." The latter part of this reflection had reference to a certain fair-haired girl to whom, for the last 6 months, Luke Marriott had been engaged. Yesterday there had appeared to be no very immediate prospect of their marriage taking place. Both Luke and Ethel had made up their minds to wait until his professional exertions should succeed in securing him a sufficient income, before embarking upon the matrimonial career. But today the postman's knock had dispelled the necessity for waiting any longer. A few lines written in a cramped hand informed the struggling young doctor that he was a comparatively rich man, and need remain a struggling young doctor no longer. The rosy cloud of reflections in which this unexpected communication had wrapped him caused Luke Marriott to be temporarily oblivious to the fact that the lawyer's letter contained a request for an early interview. When he read the letter a 4th time, this unimportant clause attracted his attention. Half an hour later, a hansom deposited him at the door of the lawyer's office. He was immediately shown into a private room, and as he entered, a tall, soberly dressed man rose from a table and extended his hand. "Mr. Luke Marriott?" said he, gravely scrutinizing Luke's face. "Yes," said Luke. "I received your letter this morning, Mr. Hilton. I need not say that the contents took me very much by surprise. I have called in obedience to your request, and to be put in possession of all further particulars." Mr. Hilton inclined his head. "You are to be congratulated, Mr. Marriott, upon having inherited a very substantial property. Pray sit down. I have been the family solicitor of the late Mr. Craddock, your cousin, and his predecessors for years, as you doubtless know. Our firm has, in fact, transacted the business of that family estate for 4 generations. He paused and looked hard at Luke Marriott. "Well?" said Luke. "For 4 generations," repeated the lawyer. "Each generation," he added slowly, "possessed a different name." "Cousins?" suggested Marriott. "Nephews in 2 instances. The late Mr. Craddock's father had an elder sister who married very young. This lady was Mr. Craddock's aunt and your grandmother. She married a Mr. Marriott. Their only son was your late father. Therefore, Mr. Marriott, you were Mr. Craddock's second cousin." "Yes, so I suppose," observed Luke. "I understood from your letter that I was the next of kin." The lawyer cleared his throat. "It is curious," he remarked, "that for 4 generations there have been no direct heirs to the Linden estate. None of the holders have married." Luke Marriott laughed. "If it is any satisfaction to you to know it, Mr. Hilton," he said, "that obligation will certainly not be neglected in the case of the present holder. I intend to marry at once." "It is a satisfaction to me," said the lawyer. "But my principal object in desiring this interview, Mr. Marriott, was to place in your hands a letter which the late Mr. Craddock instructed me to deliver personally to the next heir. To yourself, in fact. Its contents are, I fancy, of a private nature. Here it is. Will you read it?" The lawyer handed a closed and sealed envelope to Marriott as he spoke. Luke broke open the seal and read the following lines. "This is to my successor. I wish to address to him a word of advice, nay, a word of warning, before he enters into possession of his property. There is in Linden Grange a certain room which has always been kept under lock and key. Nobody except myself has entered that room during the past 10 years, save only an aged housekeeper, an old woman half-blind and deaf. The reason of this precaution I do not propose to divulge. The key of this room is in a padlocked box, which will be entrusted to the keeping of Mr. Hilton, my family solicitor. The word of advice, of warning, which I wish to address to my successor is this. If he value his happiness and his peace of mind, let him not seek to satisfy an idle curiosity by entering the room of which I have spoken. If he be a wise man, he will follow my advice. If he be a cautious one, he will heed my warning." The letter here ended abruptly, without conclusion or signature. While Luke Marriott was reading it, the old lawyer fixed his gaze upon his face with a grave and curious scrutiny. "Well," said Luke, looking up presently from the sheet of paper in his hand, "this is a strange rigmarole, Mr. Hilton, and no mistake. There is evidently some mystery. What does it all mean, I wonder?" And he glanced interrogatively at the lawyer. The lawyer shook his head with a smile. "You forget that I am in ignorance of the contents of the letter, Mr. Marriott," he replied. "Look here," said Luke, "you had better read it for yourself. In a matter of this sort I don't believe in half-confidences, and I expect you know more about my cousin's life than I do. You certainly could not know less." The lawyer took the letter from Marriott's hand and carefully adjusted his pince-nez. "You wish me to read it?" he inquired, looking at Marriott over the edge of his glasses. "Certainly." The lawyer made no reply, but proceeded at once to peruse his late client's letter. When he had digested its contents, he handed it back to Luke without comment. "Well," repeated Luke impatiently, "what does it mean?" "I am as much in the dark as you," said Mr. Hilton slowly. "No clue?" "None. I always suspected something in the nature of a mystery in Mr. Craddock's life, but I have never been enabled to give my suspicion a definite shape." "Was he mad?" demanded Luke abruptly. "By no means. A singularly clear-headed fellow, but a recluse." Luke Marriott shrugged his shoulders. "I don't believe in these fantastic chimeras," he said after a pause. "I am a doctor. If the mystery be a real one, I shall soon get to the bottom of it. If, as I suspect, it may be an imaginary one, the cause may be imputed to some nervous disorder under which my cousin may be supposed to have been suffering. You have the box containing the key?" "I will hand it over to you," said the lawyer. "Is it your intention to disregard Mr. Craddock's advice, then?" "Why, of course," laughed Luke. "Do you think I am an hysterical girl, Mr. Hilton, to be frightened at some fanciful bogey?" The lawyer smiled curiously. "I should hardly have described your cousin as an hysterical girl either," he observed. "Perhaps he was a dyspeptic," suggested Marriott. perhaps," said Mr. Hilton dryly, and then he turned the conversation into business channels. "By the by," said he, when at last Luke rose to go, "there are the family records. You might like to look into them some day. Shall I hand them over to you now?" "Oh, some other time will do," said Luke. "Good-bye, Mr. Hilton." "Good morning, Mr. Marriott. I shall be happy to receive your instructions." He held the door open and bowed a little stiffly. "A prim, quaint old fellow," smiled Luke to himself as he stepped into his hansom and drove away. Linden Grange presented an aspect in every sense satisfactory to the eyes of its new owner when he approached it the next morning in a carriage which he had ordered to be sent down to the station to meet him. The house and grounds were enclosed in a park of extensive acreage, well timbered and undulating. The whole effect of the Grange was singularly satisfying. It gave the impression of a well-considered expenditure. Luke Marriott thought it was a home of which any man might be reasonably proud. Whatever had been the mystery or the eccentricity of his cousin's life, at least it had not deterred Mr. Craddock from bestowing a careful attention upon his property. Moreover, the interior arrangements of the house showed the late tenant to have been a man of fastidious tastes. Everything was ordered with a view to refinement and comfort, if not luxury. Among the staff of servants kept by Mr. Craddock was an old butler who had been in the service of the family for many years and had risen to the tacitly acknowledged position of major domo of the Grange. He received his new master with a grave and almost condescending courtesy. Luke Marriott, directly his eye fell upon the imposing figure of this old retainer, decided that Wilkins was a person worthy of confidence and esteem. He decided, too, that he would endeavour to elicit from the old man some kind of explanation of the mystery of the locked room. Wilkins could not have been in the family for so long a time without at least possessing some inkling of the secret, he thought. So he took an early opportunity of sounding the butler. "By the by, Wilkins," said he carelessly, "there is a room here that your late master, my cousin, used, I'm told, to keep generally locked." "Yes, sir," said the butler impressively. "Always." "Ah, have you any idea why?" Wilkins pursed his lips. He had an inscrutable face. "Mr. Craddock gave me no reason, sir," he answered. "Show me the room." The butler led the way up a flight of stairs and through several corridors till at length he paused in front of an oak-panelled door at the further end of a passage. "This is the room, sir," he said briefly. "Is it a bedroom?" "I don't know, sir." "What? Have you never been inside it?" "No, sir, never." Luke turned the handle and whistled softly. "Locked, of course," he muttered. Then he faced the butler. "Look here, Wilkins," said he, "you were an old and valued servant of Mr. Craddock's and of his predecessor." "Aye, and his predecessor too," interpolated the butler. "Exactly. Very well. You must, during the long course of your residence with the family, have either received some confidences or been enabled to form some conclusions of your own with regard to any family secret that may have existed. Now, it may, of course, merely have been a whim of my cousin's to keep the door of a particular room locked, or there may have been some good and sufficient reason why such a room should be kept locked up. I am in any case determined to find out this point for myself. If, therefore, you are able to assist me to do so, I shall expect you to withhold nothing from me out of a mistaken notion of loyalty to the dead. Anything, that is to say, which might be supposed to exert any influence upon the lives of the living. Now, I shall ask you a question, and I shall expect you to answer it. Does that room, to your knowledge, contain either the evidence or the record of any crime committed by any member of the family of which I am now the surviving representative?" The butler hesitated a moment. Then he cleared his throat and replied, "Well, sir, I don't see as there is anything to be gained by keeping back anything from you now. I'll tell you everything as I know, which isn't very much. To begin with, I don't know what's in that room. I say I've never been inside of it. I never heard of any crime having been committed in the family. But I know this, that my late master and the master before him, and the one before him too, used to take on strangely after they had been in that room. They never let no other soul in that house go in besides themselves, and the old woman who acts as a kind of housekeeper here, Mrs. Dale. So nobody knows what is the secret that's locked up behind that door, if there's a secret at all, which I doubt," he concluded. "Which you doubt?" asked Marriott. "Why?" "Because, sir, Mrs. Dale, nor no old woman neither, couldn't keep any secret or the likes of one for all these years, and Mrs. Dale, she says that there ain't anything in that room at all worth making a fuss about that she knows." "Ah, well, perhaps you and Mrs. Dale are right, and there is nothing there at all worth making a fuss about," replied Luke, turning on his heel. "See that the house is ready to receive me tomorrow. I shall return to town tonight." On the following day he entered into possession of his new home. He was struck by a singular sense of loneliness as he dined by himself in the large solemn chamber hung with family portraits and adorned with old-fashioned sombre furniture, which had been used as a dining room for many generations past by the owners of Linden Grange. "This is no house for a bachelor," he reflected. "How Craddock could have existed here alone for all these years and yet not gone melancholy mad is a matter for surprise. The sooner I get little Ethel here to keep me company, the better." And then, over a glass of exceptionally excellent claret, he fell into a pleasant fit of musing, induced by the image of a sweet girl face that rose up in his fancy and filled his thoughts with love dreams. By a gradual process of transition, his ideas reverted to the locked room and his cousin's absurd letter. He had not yet had leisure to penetrate the mystery. Tomorrow, however, he would explore the mysterious apartment and discover its secret. Tomorrow came, and Luke Marriott, after a leisurely breakfast, lit a cigarette and bethought himself of his resolution. He sauntered upstairs and found his way to the room at the end of the passage. For some moments he stood before the door looking at it idly, with his hand thrust deep in his pocket. As he looked, he felt suddenly conscious of a strange sensation, a sensation as of a soft magnetic current drawing him towards the room. Instinctively he turned the handle of the door, forgetting that it was locked. "Ah," said he, "I must go and fetch the key." And he turned and retraced his steps to his bedroom, where he had deposited the padlocked box containing the key of the room that had been entrusted to the keeping of Mr. Hilton. He came back presently with it, but as he approached the locked door he was again conscious of a singular sensation, this time of repulsion. He stood for a moment with the key in his hand. Then he shivered. The next instant he turned and walked rapidly back along the passage. At the end of it he stopped short. It seemed as though the act had been one of unconscious volition, and he paused, wondering, the key still in his hand. He half turned, then gave a little laugh and shrugged his shoulders. "It can wait," he said half apologetically. "I have a pile of letters to open." And he descended the stairs. 2 hours later he found himself again standing before the locked door of the room at the end of the passage, and again he was conscious of a singular disinclination to insert the key in the lock and turn it. "Now what the deuce is in that room?" he muttered. Whatever it was, he had decided to confront it alone. If the room enclosed a family mystery, it was best that the nature of it should be kept, as for so many years it had been kept, from the knowledge of the servants of the establishment. He would go in alone. "Yes," said he, "I will go in alone," and he put the key in the lock. Then he withdrew his hand from it and stood silently contemplating the dark oak panels in front of him. "I'll go in," he repeated mechanically, and the next minute he was descending the stairs. "This is folly!" he exclaimed angrily, as he discovered himself once more in the smoking room. But he did not return at once to the locked chamber. There were various matters to occupy his attention until lunchtime. After lunch he took his way reluctantly, yet with a kind of fascination, to the deserted room for the third time. This time, however, he did not pause to think. He turned the key hurriedly, pushed open the door, and strode into the apartment. His first sensation was one of astonishment. The room was empty. It was a lofty chamber, and through a large oriel window the rays of the sun poured in, flooding the room with a gorgeous light. In the centre stood a huge old-fashioned four-poster bed. The room contained the ordinary furniture of a lady's boudoir. Luke Marriott stood in the middle of this apartment, and his eye travelled round it, quickly taking in its general details before he allowed himself a more categorical examination. Nothing in the shape of a mystery presented itself to his cursory vision. But suddenly, as he was in the act of changing his position, he became conscious of another and very remarkable sensation. His eyes had been fixed upon a costly Persian rug that lay upon the polished boards, when he felt acutely conscious that he was being stared at by an invisible person. In obedience to an uncontrollable impulse, he raised his eyes from the floor and let them wander slowly round the walls of the room, following, as it were, the guidance of some magnetic line, till they rested upon a picture half concealed behind the folds of the arras. Only a portion of the picture was visible, but that portion was the upper part of a woman's face, and from it there gazed down upon Luke such a pair of eyes as never in the course of his life had his glance before encountered. His first impression was that they were the eyes of a living person, the glowing eyes of a living woman, burning, vivid, voluptuous, and he uttered a cry of astonishment as his own met them. He took a step forward. A ray of sunlight played slantingly across the arras, forming a half aureole for the face in the picture. He tore aside the folds of the arras and started back, and with parted lips stood gazing at the face before him. He perceived on a bare canvas block the oil-colour portrait of a girl, a young girl. She could scarcely have been more than 21, but never had Luke Marriott's gaze rested on a countenance so transcendently lovely. It surpassed the wildest imaginings of an artist or a voluptuary's dream. Its loveliness seemed scarcely human, less divine, and for this reason the more compelling, the more fatal, the more destructive. It was the loveliness of a perfectly, gloriously beautiful devil. Luke found himself wondering how any mortal artist could have transferred to lifeless canvas so living an image, for though it was a picture that he was gazing upon, he felt unable to divest himself of the singular impression that it was a human being. The impression grew as he gazed. A picture? Those eyes could not belong to a picture. There must be a soul, an animating spirit behind them. They caught and chained his own with their wide and lustrous glance. The dark, glowing orbs seemed to burn into his brain and draw his identity from him, overwhelming him with a bewildering, helpless sense of slavish worship. The full red lips seemed to curve into a living smile of invitation. The soft cheeks took on the hue of life. The rounded bosom rose and fell. A picture? With a sudden effort, Luke Marriott put his hand to his brow and, turning, fled from the room. He did not pause to criticise the impulse upon which he had acted till he stood again in the breakfast-room, alone and out of breath. Then he permitted himself to reflect. "A very lovely picture," said he, lighting a cigarette thoughtfully. "A lovely picture, no more." He took 2 or 3 puffs at his cigarette. "A picture," he added, "that it is not good for a man's peace of mind to look upon too long." He might further have added, especially if the man is engaged to be married. But the practical influence of a bit of painted canvas upon the emotions of a healthy man seemed too chimerical to be taken seriously into account. So far he had encountered nothing in the shape of a mystery. He had encountered merely the presentment of a lovely face on canvas, hardly a sufficient pretext for the fantastic warning of his cousin, he reflected. Yet, even as he reflected, he seemed to be uneasily conscious of the burning eyes fixed upon him. He wrote a long letter to his fiancée Ethel after dinner. He gave her a full and vivacious description of the beauties and possibilities of the Grange as their place of future residence. He extolled its many advantages, spoke enthusiastically of the magnificent old park, the well-kept grounds, the stately building, but curiously enough, he refrained from mention of the portrait of the girl in the locked room. It was, after all, a mere incident, unimportant, of no significance, and scarcely likely to interest Ethel. Yet, for an insignificant incident, it exercised a remarkable effect on Luke Marriott. His sleep that night was restless and troubled by wild dreams. He rose from it unrefreshed, and after breakfast he turned his steps once more to the room at the end of the passage. He determined to explore it more thoroughly and at leisure, in order, if possible, to come upon the secret of his cousin's mystery. He entered it, and then forgot everything save the presence of the picture staring down at him from the opposite wall. The smile on its face was still there, but it seemed now to partake somewhat of a sinister character. The eyes were riveted on his, glorious, luminous, alive. He looked into their depths and was lost. How long he remained in the room he could not have told. Slowly, and like one awaking from a dream, he at length crept out into the passage, closing the door and locking it behind him. Shamefaced, like one dishonoured in his self-esteem, he found his way back to the smoking-room and flung himself into an armchair. "So," he muttered, "that is Craddock's secret." And his eye fell on a small photograph of Ethel that he had placed on the mantelpiece, and he laughed a little harshly. "I am a doctor," he said, "and mustn't give way to these morbid fancies." None the less, he gave way to them. He was thoroughly versed in the phenomena of hypnotism. He was capable of estimating the possibilities of self-hypnosis. Yet, in spite of this, he could not admit to his satisfaction the operation of the latter process in the present instance. A wilder idea possessed him. He could not shake it off. It dominated his thoughts and influenced his moods. He found himself slipping into a lotus-like disregard for the daily interests and duties of ordinary life. 6 weeks passed. Luke Marriott was beginning to be unconscious of time. It existed for him only in relation to the recurrence of certain periods daily, periods during which he would disappear into the locked room, and at the end of them emerge vague, staggering, like a man intoxicated with strange emotions, some fierce narcotic of the soul. And of all this he spoke to no one. It was not, however, without many a severe struggle that he at length succumbed to the slavery of this unnatural allegiance. In his clearer moments he resolutely submitted these psychological phases to the test of an accurate logic. What was the force, he asked, that hid itself behind the eyes of a picture and conjured the soul, the reason, out of a man's body and mastered his will? Was it an active living force or not? If not, how could it clothe the inanimate objects of physical perception with the idea, the very aspect of life? Why, in spite of reason and the evidence of his senses, did this wild idea assail his imagination? Logic provided no answer. It never does where the emotions are concerned. The fact only remained that Luke Marriott, deliberately and conscious of the absurdity of such a conviction, accepted the painted portrait as a living woman, and he knew that a woman was luring him, body and soul, to his destruction. Do what he would, he could not keep away from the locked room. He lived at a high pressure of esoteric emotion, and his hold on the interests of life was daily slipping from him. Ethel's letters came to him regularly, yet merely with a mechanical precision he answered them, and with a pang he became conscious that Ethel, like the other incidents of his actual life, had now no further interest for him either. Now he seemed incapable of loving anyone or anything except... He started and shook himself. Was he a man or an automaton, he demanded angrily of his conscience. At all hazards, at all costs, before it was too late, he must save himself from the moral and physical destruction with which he was threatened. Not yet had he succumbed to the influence beyond chance of redemption, nor would he. The idea of flight suggested itself to him. He dismissed it as unworthy of his manhood, and moreover as a step involving the necessity of explanation and capable of strange constructions. Why had not Craddock decided, and Craddock's predecessor? For Luke Marriott knew well enough now the nature of the mystery that had enveloped the lives of the masters of Linden Grange. They had succumbed, but he would not. They lacked courage to destroy, and were themselves destroyed. For himself, he was made of different stuff. All that day he did not so much as approach the locked room. Alienated even temporarily from this horrible fascination, his perception of ordinary matters regained somewhat of their moral character. He noticed for the first time that Wilkins, the butler, cast strange and furtive glances at him as he passed. Also that there was a curious expression upon the old man's face. He called the servant to him. "You have something on your mind, Wilkins," said he. "Speak out. What is it?" "Well, sir, if I may make so bold," said the butler, looking up with sudden resolution, "it goes against my sense of what's right to see a fine young man like you, sir, going the way of the others, and as it might be in a moment." "Going the way of the others?" repeated Luke. "Mr. Craddock, sir, began the same way," explained Wilkins, "and Mr. Burke before him, and Mr. Bray too. And what was the end of it? Why, sir, they might all as well have been buried alive, for never a soul did they see, nor speak to, nor stir out of this house from the year's end to the next till they died. Sure enough they died. Mortal flesh and blood couldn't stand that sort of life. They all died young, sir," concluded the butler ominously. There was a slight pause. "Don't you go for to die young, sir," admonished Wilkins solemnly. Luke Marriott did not heed him. He was thinking of the picture, and of Ethel, and his resolution. Anyway, he would not die young. Presently he looked up. "You said that you didn't know what was the secret cause of these strange results upon Mr. Craddock and the others, Wilkins?" "No, sir, I never knew. But it's something to do with that locked room, sir, though Mrs. Dale says there's nothing in it. And I can't say as she's wrong, for I've never been inside the room myself. No, nor wouldn't go inside. Not for all the gold of the Indies," added the old man with emphasis. "Was there ever a lady in this house?" inquired Luke. "Not in my time, sir, but when I was a young boy I heard Mr. Bray's uncle tell of a young lady who once belonged to the family. She was very beautiful and, they said, a bit wild. She killed herself, sir. There was a story, I believe." "A story?" "A love affair, Mr. Marriott, but I never knew the rights of it. I was only a boy when I heard the tale, and I can't remember nothing about it." Luke Marriott thought of the family papers. They had been dispatched to him by the lawyer, Mr. Hilton, in a tin box, together with other private documents which he had hitherto found neither opportunity nor inclination to examine. "I will read them tonight," he mentally resolved. "Well, Wilkins," he said aloud with a smile, "you need not distress yourself on my account. I do not intend to emulate the example of my predecessors. Indeed, you will shortly have to prepare this house for the reception of a certain young lady." The butler gave a little eager start. "Why, sir, you don't mean—" he began. "Yes, I do," said Luke. "I'm going to get married." "Thank the Lord!" exclaimed Wilkins. And the fervour of the ejaculation may be supposed to have provided its own excuse. Luke smiled again. "You can go, Wilkins," he said, and turned to his writing desk. But a strange, oppressive sense of responsibility now began to rest upon him. Today should end that influence once and for all. He walked to the sideboard and poured himself out a glass of brandy. "Alcohol is an antidote to objective influences," he laughed grimly as he drained the glass. Then he carefully selected a large table knife from a tray in the breakfast room. The picture, he remembered, had no glass covering. The canvas, stretched on a block, might have been transferred direct from the artist's easel to a temporary frame which had, by chance or design, become a permanent one. The afternoon was already far advanced. The sun slanted low through the window. Rapidly and with resolute steps, Luke Marriott strode across the hall and up the stairs and along the passage till he reached the corridor at the end of which was the locked room. Here, for a moment, he paused, perhaps to gather resolution, perhaps only to draw a deep breath. An instant later he had turned the key in the lock and, slamming the door behind him, stood in the room once more. He looked up. His eyes met the eyes of the picture. His head began to swim. It was no time for hesitation now. He felt for the knife and took a step forward, but the eyes held him. What had he come to do? He flung out his arms wildly with a gesture of sudden passionate abandonment. "My darling," he cried. Then he remembered again. No, a devil, curse you! And the knife was in his hand. The picture seemed to step out of its frame, and with soft, voluptuous arms of flesh to enfold him in its embrace. He knew it was only fancy. There was nothing there. It had done the same thing before, fooling his imagination with dreams, but now it was for the last time. Nothing. He felt the soft pressure of arms and softer lips. Nothing. He heard far-off silver-toned words in his ears, the music of sirens. Her face was against his own. He felt her warm breath upon his cheeks. Nothing. He shook himself free from the insidious encircling caress. "Alive or dead, fiend, devil or angel," he cried, "this is the end." And with a wild leap he reached the picture and drove his knife into the canvas, once, twice, thrice. Then from forehead to feet he rent its whole length, and as the rip of the tearing canvas filled the room, he fell back unconscious on the polished floor. When Luke Marriott opened his eyes, his first expression was one of mild surprise. He got up, looked at the knife lying at his feet, at the picture cut in strips on the wall, and whistled. "I never remember to have fainted before in my life," he muttered. Then he gazed critically at the cut canvas. So, he mused, while his eyes rested curiously on the mutilated picture, so that is the end of you, my fair Basilisk. The fierce torrent of his recent emotions had spent himself. He had even forgotten that it had ever raged fiercely at all, as one forgets the physical sensation of pain when the physical cause of it is removed. He remembered the fact only, and he regarded the result before him dispassionately. The picture was destroyed, and with it was destroyed at the same moment that subtle, strange influence which had come so near to destroying the destroyer. But what was the nature of that influence? Luke confessed himself still at fault. He was unwilling to believe that he had been the victim of some variety of self-hypnosis, yet at a loss to suggest a more satisfactory theory. At least he was determined to destroy the picture utterly. With this object in view, he approached the frame and detached it from its support on the wall. The block upon which the canvas had been fastened was hollow. As Luke took it down, something fluttered from the rent in the picture and fell to the floor. Luke stooped and picked up a sheet of thin paper closely written upon. The paper had evidently been concealed in the hollow space between the stretched canvas and the cardboard of the block. He looked at the writing. It was that of a woman, small yet firm, and the ink on the paper was yellow and faded. He smoothed out the creases and, drawing a chair to the window, sat down. Old Hilton, he muttered, said that he possessed no clue to the mystery. This letter, whatever it is, looks remarkably like a clue of sorts. And then he began to read it by the light of the setting sun. In spite of the faded ink, the writing on the paper was legible enough, and Luke Marriott had no difficulty in deciphering the following lines. I, Marion Gray, aged 22, and in the full possession of my senses, am about to write down these last words for the benefit of anybody who sooner or later may chance to find and read them. I have determined to kill myself here in this room beside my own portrait, and my spirit, if I have one, shall haunt this room and live in this portrait of mine so long as it shall last, working out my vengeance upon every man who looks upon it for the wrong done to me by one man here in this house. May the beauty of my face work destruction upon all men who gaze upon it, and through the eyes of my picture may my soul lure them on to their ruin. Let every man who looks upon the face in this picture forget for ever wife, sweetheart, child, in one overmastering passion for the dead woman whose spirit smiles at him from this canvas to destroy him, body and soul, utterly and for ever. Thus may I hope to revenge myself upon mankind through the generations to come for the sake of the injury done to me by one man whom I loved. May the spirit of evil help me to carry out my vengeance. Marion Gray. Twice Luke Marriott read through this singular document, carefully from beginning to end. Then he thrust his hands deep in his pockets and stood by the window whistling softly. The edge of the red ball of the sun was just visible over the fringe of a distant avenue of elms. A pigeon flew out suddenly from the trees, and passing the arc of flame seemed lost in a glow of gold as Marriott watched it. He turned from the window with a strange smile. Perhaps it is the soul of Marion Gray escaping from the picture to the light, he murmured. That was The Basilisk of the Grange by Emeric Hulme-Beaman, the third story I've recorded by this neglected author, in which he puts his twist on the familiar haunted picture story. Hulme-Beaman chooses a happy ending for his Otherwise, such stories tend to have the picture remaining triumphant and keeping its power. I hope you enjoyed this story. If so, please remember to click the like button, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel for more creepy stories. I have a whole list of them in the Audiobooks playlist. And, as always, thank you for listening.